My name is David Savage, a docent of the Cincinnati Heritage Programs at the Cincinnati Museum Center. This is a story of the famous or infamous Cincinnati subway. Beneath the broad expanse of today's Central Parkway lie the remains of a transportation dream built on the bones of an older, extinct transportation system. It began with the burgeoning of the Midwest Canal System. The overwhelming success of the Albany to Buffalo Canal, linking Lake Erie with the Hudson River, had awakened others to the commercial and transportation values to be derived from this mode of transport. Thus, in Ohio, 2 north-south canals were constructed between 1825 and 1840. The first linking Cleveland with Portsmouth, and the second connecting Cincinnati with Toledo. This second canal, the Miami and Erie Canal, came down through western Ohio and into the Cincinnati area through the Mill Creek Valley. In St. Bernard, it veered to the west to go around the base of Clifton Hill, and, making a sharp turn at Plum Street, it went due east down 11th Street to Broadway, where the casino now stands. A ladder of 10 locks took the canal down to the Ohio River, completing the 250-mile transit from Lake Erie. By 1856, the canal was functionally obsolete due to the emergence of railroads as a more convenient and economic alternative. In 1877, the canal was abandoned by the city, and so there it sat, a festering channel of stagnant water, garbage, and trash. By 1884, it was described by the local media as being foully smelling and miasma breeding. Still, even then, it was a playground for the children from the tenements in Over the Rhine. After it was drained in the early 20th century, the remaining puddles continued to be an attractive nuisance. In 1884, the Cincinnati Graphic, a local magazine, caught the city's attention with the publication of a dream. They portrayed a young woman lying on the banks of the fetid canal with her eyes closed. Her dream, shown below her in stark contrast to the putrefying canal, was of a wide thoroughfare lined with well-appointed and impressive shops and stores, crowds and carriages passing by in profusion. Beneath the surface of this idyllic parkway, a steam-powered train moved on smooth tracks in a broad tunnel, pulling cars filled with passengers passing through the city in serene comfort. The caption spoke clearly, "A dream, will it ever be fulfilled?" This began a debate about urban transportation. As the 20th century was ushered in, the city was experiencing a number of problems which made it difficult to move easily within the downtown and to travel from the suburbs to the center city. There was an extensive streetcar system, privately owned by various entrepreneurs, traveling on chartered routes throughout the city. In this system, there were 700 streetcars and 222 miles of track. With the growth of population, carriages, horse-drawn wagons, and pedestrians mixed together with the streetcars to create severe traffic problems. Added to that was the new, increasingly popular mode of transport, the automobile. The result was a near standstill during the busy hours of the day. Further, there were a number of electric interurban cars that provided rapid and economical passenger transportation in the broader region of southwest Ohio. While the equipment and trackways were not as robust as the regular steam railroads, nevertheless, they provided a popular mode of transportation between Cincinnati and other destinations such as Lebanon, Dayton, Hillsborough, Hamilton, Chillicothe, Portsmouth and southeast Indiana. However, these cars would not run on the streetcar tracks that served the downtown Cincinnati. As a result, passengers destined for the city center would have to transfer from the interurban car to a Cincinnati streetcar at the edge of the city, a most inconvenient process. At the beginning of the 20th century, underground transportation in urban areas was not a new idea. There were precedents. In 1863, the City of London built and operated an underground railway for transport across the broad reaches of the city. Because the cars were pulled by a coal-fired steam locomotive, the tunnels had to be huge so that the smoke would not suffocate the passengers. Because of this smoke problem, there was a search for a non-hazardous alternative to the steam engine. Today, we see an example of a unique way of moving things through a tube. The pneumatic tube at the drive-up window of your local bank uses air pressure differences to move checks, money, and receipts from the driver to the teller and return. In 1869, an innovative engineer by the name of Alfred Beach proposed to the City Fathers of New York to build a subway system based on that same principle. The civic leaders were not convinced, so on his own he built a 1-block-long demonstration tunnel and car in the middle of Manhattan. He advertised it and opened it up to the public at 25 cents a ride. It carried 11,000 passengers in the first 2 weeks and amassed a total of 400,000 riders during the year that it was in operation. The City Fathers were still not convinced, and the development of a practical underground transportation system awaited the development of a new propulsive power. In 1897, when electric power was practical and common, the city of Boston built their first rapid transit line, which traveled underground from the congested urban center to tracks above ground in the suburbs. A few years later, in 1904, the New York built their first subway in Manhattan. Cincinnati, the city was enthralled by the prospects of a rapid transit system that connected the perimeter with the center city and alleviated the increasingly problematic traffic congestion. To this end, they began considering a variety of possible plans. The first, in 1905, had a route that began downtown at 5th and Walnut, went underground up Walnut Street to Canal Street, then followed the route of the canal underground to Liberty Street, where it emerged into an open trench to move to North Side, where it could connect with the interurbans arriving from the north and west. In a separate but related study in 1907, the above-ground route above the tunnel was to become a parkway, as envisioned by the graphic in 1884. Nothing came of either of these proposed projects until 1911, when a new mayor, Henry Hunt, was elected, wresting absolute control from Boss Cox. George B. Cox was a political boss who rose from being a ward runner to controlling the political life of the city for over 30 years. While the city was under his influence, Cincinnati was called one of the 2 worst governed cities in the country. Hunt himself was anti-Boss Cox, but still had to deal with a pro-Cox city council. Nevertheless, he was successful in appointing a rapid transit commission that had the authority to propose a construction and operating plan and to have the issue placed before the voters to fund the whole affair. Hunt also secured a lease from the state for the city's use of the canal right-of-way from Broadway to 300 feet north of Mitchell Avenue at an annual cost of $32,000. In 1912, the Rapid Transit Commission hired Bjorn Arnold, the planner of the Boston Rapid Transit System, to propose a plan for Cincinnati. The plan as submitted was much more comprehensive than any of the previous efforts. It was for a complete encirclement of the urban center, with a local loop to serve the downtown. The larger circle began at Canal Street, moved north through the Mill Creek Valley, passed through St. Bernard, then turned east through Norwood and Oakley, returning to the city center. It passed through East Walnut Hills, went across the face of the hill above Fulton, then tunneled through Mount Adams before returning to Canal Street. The downtown loop went from the main line at Canal Street, down Walnut to 5th Street, west on 5th Street to Plum, and then north on Plum to rejoin the main line at Canal Street. It was an ambitious plan, a loop 16 miles in length, costing more than $13 million. It would ease the downtown traffic problems, connect the near suburbs to the center city, and accommodate all of the major interurban lines. The city leaders said, "It's nice, but too expensive. Can you do it for less?" So Arnold revised the plan, reduced the number of stations, eliminating the downtown loop and removing the tunnel through Mount Adams. The revised cost was $12 million. The Rapid Transit Commission approved the revised plan and prepared to put the issues before the voters. The promise was cars 70 feet long, about twice the length of a streetcar. Trains would be 4 cars long. Trains would be spaced 1 minute and 9 seconds apart, with a capacity of 100,000 passengers per hour. All of this would be available at a fare of a nickel. In 1916, the voters were asked to approve a bond issue for only $6 million, half the amount necessary to complete the system. The rationale was that if you got half the system up and running, the voters would be so enamored of the convenience they would demand that the system be completed. Not surprisingly, the issue passed by a 6-to-1 margin. In the following year, the Rapid Transit Commission put enabling legislation before the public, codifying the 5-cent fare and designating the Cincinnati Traction Company, a privately owned for-profit streetcar company, as its operating entity. At this point, all of the pieces were now in place to begin creating a rapid transit system for Cincinnati. But before the work could begin, the United States became embroiled in World War I. The federal government suspended all non-essential projects, and thus the Cincinnati system was put on hold. Further complications arose when the Ohio State Supreme Court ruled that the plan to have the privately owned Cincinnati Traction Company operate the system was unconstitutional, because a public entity, the city of Cincinnati, could not put its full faith and credit, the bonds, behind a project that would benefit a private for-profit company. Nevertheless, after the war was over and the federal restraints were no longer in place, on a cold day in January 1920, at the corner of Walnut and Canal Street, construction began. The canal, when built, was 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep. That depth was enough to float a fully loaded canal boat. However, for subway construction, the canal bed had to be excavated to a depth of 20 feet to accommodate the tunnels and associated infrastructure. Once the excavation was completed, they could then begin constructing the tunnels with reinforced concrete and then finish by covering the completed tunnel with dirt and paving. The construction needed to be robust because the tunnel structure would eventually need to support the weight of paving and traffic that would run on the surface. Because of the reduced scope of the project, the stations were only roughed in, lacking electricity and lighting. While the trackway was prepared with the necessary wooden sleepers, no tracks were installed anywhere along the route. Once the route emerged from the underground tunnels, the above-ground stations were built. But like their underground counterparts, they were just concrete shells, monuments to a dream. The above-ground right-of-way was graded, awaiting the installation of trackage. The rails shown in this photo are for hauling construction materials, not for the rapid transit cars. At Mitchell Avenue, a new bridge was built, replicating the aqueduct that formerly carried the canal across the street at this same point. As the route turned east, north of St. Bernard, short tunnels were built in Norwood to avoid interference with surface streets and railroads. The construction was not without problems. The major issue was the cost of construction materials. After the war, the cost of steel and concrete doubled, and the cost of construction was inflated far above the original estimates. Secondly, the early 20s saw a resurgence in the drive to organize the workforce. Sporadic stoppages slowed the construction schedule. Third, the post-glacial alluvial soil, which underlies much of Cincinnati, was unstable, and small slides during construction were not uncommon. Beneath that pile of dirt in the lower right of this picture, there is a horse, trapped and killed by the sliding soil. And lastly, that same instability of soil that caused collateral damage buildings abutting the excavation. Payment to compensate the property owners was another financial drain, further exacerbating the financial problems. Still, by the late 20s, with the aid of a second bond issue dedicated solely to the above-ground street construction, the Broadwood Parkway covering the downtown tunnel was beginning to take shape. This view is to the north as the Parkway runs behind Music Hall. But by 1925, the money, $6 million, originally voted for in the 1916 election, was gone, used up, finished. While there had been some charges of corruption in the construction process, the city was still controlled by the Cox machine. A state audit found that the work had been done as specified with no unusual inflated invoices. And speaking of the Cox machine, by 1924 the people of Cincinnati had finally tired of their corrupt politics, and under the leadership of true reformers, major changes were underway at City Hall. A Cincinnati-born, Harvard-educated attorney, Murray Seasongood, led a reform movement that succeeded in establishing a charter form of government. The new charter established a city council of 9 members elected at large, replacing the unwieldy and crony-controlled 32-member council elected from each of the city's wards. The charter also put the day-to-day operation of the city into the hands of a professional city manager, not a party boss. In the election of 1925, Seasongood was elected to the new city council, and then was elected mayor by his councilmanic colleagues. Seasongood was not a rapid transit advocate. He had come to the considered conclusion that the construction project had been mismanaged by the Rapid Transit Commission, that completing the work would be far more costly than projected, and that its operation would never be profitable. In 1928, he dissolved the commission by the simple expedient of not replacing the members when their terms expired. The Cincinnati Rapid Transit Project had come to an end. So, what got built? There were 2 miles of subway tunnel in the downtown area between Walnut Street and Harrison Avenue in Brighton. In addition, 9 miles of right-of-way had been graded with the necessary overpasses and underpasses. Finally, 6 stations had been roughed in. That was it, and there it sat. Above ground in the downtown area, using the proceeds of the 1924 bond issue, Central Parkway had been completed as envisioned in the 1907 plan. In 1927, the Rapid Transit Commission, under fire from Seasongood, hired the Beeler Organization, a consulting firm, to review the project and report their findings. They recommended that the city complete the modified project as planned, complete the downtown subway loop, and merge all of the competing streetcar companies into a single entity. The cost was estimated to be an additional $10 million. The council sporadically debated this recommendation over the next 3 years, and then the Depression hit. The proposal came to an end, as had the Rapid Transit Commission. In 1936, the Engineers Club of Cincinnati was commissioned by the City Council to look once again at the city's transportation needs. Their report concluded that the traffic conditions and need had changed substantially since 1910. The interurbans had disappeared. Automobile ownership and usage had grown by leaps and bounds, and center city streetcars still made a major contribution to traffic congestion in the downtown area. Their recommendation was to complete the downtown underground loop for use by streetcars, ban the use of streetcars on the surface in the center city, and use the existing rapid transit infrastructure to bring streetcars from the suburbs into the downtown area. This report, like the Beeler report before it, was discussed for 3 years without action. In 1940, the Brinkerhoff engineering firm was engaged to study the traffic situation in Cincinnati once again, with a view to using the existing subway infrastructure. Their recommendation, like the Engineers Club study, was to widen the downtown perimeter streets, use the existing tunnels as part of an underground loop for streetcars, and remove the streetcars from the surface in the center city. World War II then intervened, and no action was taken. After the war, with a look towards the future of the city, a comprehensive master plan was developed and published in 1948. One of the clear recommendations was to have no further consideration of using the tunnels or other parts of the proposed rapid transit system. And there it sat, 2 miles of subway tunnel running beneath Central Parkway from Walnut Street to Brighton. There have been many suggestions for the alternative use of this unique space. It was thought that it could be used to bring freight cars into the downtown area, saving the need to unload in the railroad and truck the goods into downtown. But the size and number of cars required were too great for the tunnel. Some folks, thinking that the underground would be like a cave with a constant cool temperature, suggesting using the tunnel as a wine cellar for the wineries of Cincinnati. The reality is that the tunnels are hot and humid in the summer and cold and damp in the winter, hardly ideal for storing fine wine. The idea of using the tunnel as warehouse space for the downtown businesses was impractical and unsatisfactory for the same temperature and humidity reasons that sank the wine cellar ship. Some bright-eyed but impractical aeronautical engineers from the University of Cincinnati suggested that by installing large fans at tunnel entrances, they could create the world's largest wind tunnel, thus enabling the evaluation of full-size aircraft. Imaginative but impractical. A group of local entrepreneurs, inspired by Underground Atlanta, suggested turning the tunnels into a subterranean shopping mall and entertainment venue. Very quickly, they learned the limitations and the costs of conversion. So, how have the tunnels been used? In the early 1960s, in the midst of the Cold War, the Liberty Street station was converted into an underground command center for emergency responders in the event of an attack on Cincinnati. Bunk beds, water and sewer lines, electric power, lighting, and telephones were installed, along with emergency supplies of drinking water and food rations. Fortunately, it was never needed, and eventually, after vandals had trashed the space, the equipment and supplies were removed. In the late 1950s, the Cincinnati Water Works installed a 50-inch water main to carry water from the water treatment plant in the east to the reservoirs supplying the west side. The use of the tunnel to cross the downtown area, rather than doing new excavation, was a major cost saving. The water main is still in use today. As communication technology changed, the tunnel was used to locate part of a fiber-optic cable network serving downtown businesses. What does it look like today in the abandoned tunnels underneath Central Parkway? At the intersection with Race Street, there is a large locked metal door. Open that door and you will find a stairway that takes you down into the Race Street station. If you walk along the platform in gloomy darkness towards Walnut Street, you encounter that large water main and eventually the bricked up end of the tunnel. Moving westward, you come to the Plum Street Bend. Above ground, it is a rather sharp turn, but below ground, the bend is much more gentle so that the ghosts of those four-car trains can easily follow the curve. Moving north, there are simply well-constructed, empty tunnels. The original plan for the subway had an underground loop that went down Walnut Street to 5th, across 5th to Plum Street, and then up Plum Street to rejoin the main line at Central Parkway. While this loop was never built, in anticipation of later construction, short interconnecting stubs were provided. At Liberty Street, another set of locked metal doors on the surface. The Liberty Street station awaits cars that will never come. The exit point of the below-ground portion of the rapid transit system is by I-75, just north of the Western Hills Viaduct. These locked portals are used to provide access for maintenance in the tunnel. Incidentally, Cincinnati recoups some of the cost of the abandoned system by using the value of the right-of-way as a match for federal funds in building I-75. Short tunnels were built to pass underneath Hopple Street. In the final analysis of this epic story, the automobile won. Looking back at the transportation modes, it started with the canal, which worked well for its time. The rapid transit system, never implemented, would have used much of this same route. Today, as we look at I-75, the Norwood Lateral, I-71, and Fort Washington Way, we see that those routes designed for today's automobile traffic follow the route anticipated by Cincinnati's never-built rapid transit system. Thank you, and I hope that you enjoyed this story of the Cincinnati subway.